So I am a middle-aged woman with gray hair and blue eyes, and my preferred pronouns are she and her. And today I'm going to talk about designing for people with cognitive disabilities, as well as everybody else. The art of designing and creating content to support people with cognitive disabilities involves practices from usability, from accessibility, and a lot of the practices we've been talking about today from plain language. I'm going to talk about some of the design patterns, some of the approaches to support people with disabilities that relate to attention, to executive function, to language, to learning, and to memory. These recommendations are not accessibility standards. They're recommended best practices, and they improve the user experience for everybody. So moving to slide 2, the goals of today's talk are to really humanize and diversify this concept, this category of cognitive and learning disabilities, and to really introduce design patterns that support people with those disabilities. If you leave here with a better understanding of the diverse needs of individuals with cognitive and learning disabilities and some next steps to supporting them, I will consider this very successful. On slide 3, I've got an agenda. I'm going to do a little bit of background information. I want to talk about some personas, some design patterns, just to get you thinking along these lines, briefly talk about a design guide or a system, and then I will answer questions. Slide 4 begins the background, and moving to slide 5, I want to just kind of start by providing some information about what we kind of consider functional needs when we talk about disability. And so if you look at section 508, there is this category on functional needs. And it really, if you look at some of the physical functional needs, like vision, they are subdivided. So you have with limited vision, or without vision, or with limited ability to perceive color. But when you look at that list, all of cognitive and learning disabilities are really grouped together into a single category. And it really oversimplifies an area that is every bit as complex as the physical visible disability realm. And so we can subdivide it, and we should take a few minutes just to talk about that. So when we talk about this category, we're really talking about individuals, or the ability to use things with limited attention, with the ability to use it with limited language or literacy, with limited learning or ability to learn, with limited memory, with limited executive functions, and limited mental health. And so there's some examples of this. For example, limited attention might be something like attention deficit disorder. Limited language and literacy might be aphasia or dyscalculia. Limited learning might be a brain injury, might be dyslexia. Limited memory might be something like age-related forgetfulness or mild cognitive impairment. We talk about that executive area. Again, it might be due to a brain injury, might be somebody on the autism spectrum. And when we talk about mental health, at least for this kind of area to start with, we're talking a little bit about anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as other mental health challenges. And so just those are really short, quick examples and hardly represent the complexity of this area. Even within some of those functional needs, we could subdivide them again. So for example, with attention, within that attention, it could be limited ability to focus attention, or limited ability to direct attention, or limited ability to shift between items. And so again, just really want to convey the complexity in this area. Moving to slide 6, those are some of the permanent disabilities that affect this space. But the reality is we're coming out of COVID. We are all tired and fatigued and stressed. There's an image here that I think captures where many of us have been over the last few years, of a woman holding her head and staring at her computer in stress. And all of that distraction and fatigue and stress does cause us to really have a situational disability that benefits from all of the strategies that we've been talking about today, and that I'm going to talk about, that make things easier to understand, that reduce our cognitive load when we're trying to use websites or documents or any other digital content. In addition, thinking about these strategies helps for individuals who are using foreign languages or measurements that they're not familiar with. Moving on to slide 7. What I'm talking about today is really going to come from a document that was created by the Cognitive Accessibility Task Force of the W3C, called Making Content Usable, for people with cognitive and learning disabilities. And hopefully we can get the links to that in the chat. There are two versions of this document. And I need to stress again, these are not standards from the W3C. These are best practice recommendations, and they are so valuable. There are advantages to each of the two versions that are available. So the first one is a document version. It has more information in it, and it is easier to import. If you're going to use this information behind a firewall, you can just pick the document up and you can use it. But it also is a really long document. I think it's about 123 pages. There's a lot of content. It can feel a bit overwhelming. The other version is the web format, which is easier to navigate. It can feel less overwhelming, but it also is a little harder to pull in or use separate from having access to the web right there. And it doesn't have quite as much information as the document is there. But both of these contain a lot of the information I'm going to talk about today, and they are great resources to get you started on this journey. Slide 8 talks about the objectives that that document is broken. It is organized by these objectives. The first is to help users understand what things are and how to use them. The second is to help users find what they need. The third is to use clear and understandable content. And we're going to come back to that because that's really where plain language fits within this set of information. Number 4 is to help users avoid mistakes and know how to correct them when they make those mistakes. The 5th objective is to help users focus. The 6th is to ensure processes do not rely on memory. The 7th is to provide help and support. And the 8th is to support adaptation and personalization. So this document provides design patterns and strategies to help when you're creating electronic content, do all of these things. So that slide 9 is transitioning us to personas, and that is all included in the document as well. Personas are a way to represent a large amount of data or information in a personal way that helps people relate to user needs. And the COGA task force has really carefully constructed the personas they present to counter some of the unconscious bias that I think many of us bring to talking about this topic around cognitive and learning disabilities. Often, there's this kind of bias or initial thought that we're really talking about people and only people with significant intellectual disabilities. And the reality, again, is this user experience in this area is highly varied, and the personas help capture that. I think these are so valuable. I'm going to touch on 3, but the slides, if you download them, include all of the different personas that were created and then tie back to all of those objectives I just talked about. So the first persona is on slide 10. And this presents Alison. She is an aging user with a mild cognitive impairment. And as a little bit of a background story, Alison has a medical background. She has been working in rehabilitation of physical injuries. She did recently decide, though, to go part-time so she could have more time with her grandchildren and take up some hobbies. She considers 63 to be the new 36, but she's finding she has some difficulty concentrating, and she's not always sure what the word she wants to say. And so the persona, that's a little bit of her background, but the persona then says a problem for her is, I'm not sure what I should press. I pressed something that looked like the buy button, but it did nothing. I'm not sure if it's me or if this website just doesn't work. What works well, though, is the buy button is something that's was clearly something I could click. The process was easy. I have bought matching dresses for all my grandchildren. And so each of these personas kind of gives you a key problem and then what a solution would look like. It also ties to these sample user needs, like using a familiar hierarchy in design or consistent visual design, clearly identifying controls in their use and making the relationship between those controls and the content they affect very clear, providing human help and making it easy to find help and give feedback. So I did want to just mention, this is a persona that's been gathered. This is not a real person, but it is gathered from all the information the COGA task force did in researching these areas and puts it together with a person that's relatable and memorable. The next persona on slide 11 is Kwame, who is a traumatic brain injury survivor. And so he was involved in a serious car crash that left him with some physical, sensory, and cognitive and learning disabilities because he has sustained a brain injury. He has returned to work, and his friends and family have been amazed how quickly he's recovered his ability to speak and even perform some of his daily life functions. But because of that and how well that he recovered with that, they're also confused because there's still cognitive difficulties. He will get lost. He will forget what he's saying or have difficulty communicating or articulating what he wants to speak about. So his problem statement is, I got lost making a shopping order and I wanted to go back to a previous step. I hit the back button in the browser navigation bar and it reloaded the home page. I had to start all over again. What worked well was there's a clear back button on each step. And when I use the browser back button, it works too. And he has sample user needs like providing search, limiting interruptions, helping the user stay safe, avoiding too much content. So I think we've really seen some great examples of that today. Making short critical paths or making the purpose of your page clear. And that's not all of them, but that's some of those sample user needs. The third persona for today is on slide 12, and that's Gopal, a retired lawyer with dementia. And so Gopal retired from his law firms in his early 60s when he found out he was forgetting important items that needed to be discussed in his complicated caseload. He also found he was forgetting material he just read and losing or misplacing objects. He is a very intelligent man that hasn't changed, and you'll often find him reading articles about law, but he's finding he can't learn new things as quickly and he can't rely on remembering new information. So his problem statement here is, I want to turn the volume up, but there's no dial. What works well for him? There's a clear volume button with a label that makes sense, and I know what to press. Some sample user needs to support Gopal are designing forms to prevent mistakes, using clear and visible labels, accepting different input formats, so different date formats, for example, avoiding data loss and timeouts, and providing information so a user can complete and prepare for a task. And I'll talk about some of those in detail. So again, these are 3 example personas. The rest are available at the end of the slide deck. And these are something you can use to remind yourself or to talk with others about the needs of designing for individuals with cognitive and learning disabilities. Slide 13 transitions us through to the design patterns, and slide 14 begins to introduce those. And so one of the design patterns is to explain implied content. Now, that's to provide definitions or explanations for implied or ambiguous information like body gestures, emotions, jokes, sarcasm, metaphors and simile, and facial expressions. And on this slide is a picture of a baby with a really big frown on his face. And many of us would look at that and go, oh, well, he's clenching his hands and he looks angry. And so we would interpret this as angry. But not everybody can figure that out. And so including some information here to explain, why did you pick this image? What are you trying to imply with it? What is the emotional content here is an important thing. And so a lot of times in the accessibility profession, we think about alt text as being something we provide for images, but alt text isn't always available to an individual with a cognitive disability. Explaining the implied content somewhere where it is visible actually becomes important and is a little different than the way we often think about images and accessibility for images. I do challenge people when we talk about this concept to take a day and pay attention to how much implied content you use. It might be icons or emojis, it might be similes and metaphors, it might be jokes. You really will be surprised once you start paying attention. Slide 15, the design pattern is, before a user performs a task consisting of multiple steps, this is a multi-step process, ensure they have an estimate on the amount of effort required to complete the task. And that includes the time it's going to take, details of any resources they need to perform that task, an overview of the process and what the next step's going to be. And once the user starts the task, make sure they understand when the task is still in process and when it's been completed. And so this might be telling somebody before they sit down that they're going to need their driver's license and their credit card, and this task is going to probably last 20 minutes. letting people know up front lets them get everything together, and it lets them figure out a time when they can be successful. Because if it's going to be a 30-minute process and they really only have the ability to focus for 10 or 15 minutes, and that process is going to time out, or it's not going to be able to be doable if they have to stop in the middle. All of a sudden, knowing all of that is critical for them to be successful. Slide 16 is an example of this. It's from the Federal Student Aid site. And the front page says, who should complete this? Tells you exactly who. How long is it going to take? This is a 30-minute process. It's right there up front. And what do I need? I'm going to need my most recent W-2 form or my employee identification number. And so even before you sit down to do this, you know right away what you're going to need and to be successful. So that's a great example of that design pattern. Slide 17, new design pattern. Clearly state the results and disadvantages of actions, options, and selections. So if you are presenting users with actions or selections, explain the benefits, risks, and consequences of each action. And this includes changes from what the user asked for, disadvantages from the standard product or offering, or features that may be a risk to users' well-being or finances. And you want to make sure to avoid when details aren't clear when a user is selecting an option. One example might be a meal where all the meal options have fun names, but you don't really know what you're getting. So really thinking about making that clear. Slide 18 is an example from an airline where it shows very clearly that if you pick one of the seats with a star in it, it is going to have an $81 additional charge. And that's right up front. You don't have to guess. You know what you're getting. It tells you that when you make that decision, that's what the consequence or result of that decision is going to be. The next slide, slide 19, really talks to people who struggle with math, numbers, math concepts, and it's to provide an alternative for numbers or numerical concepts. And so consider providing a description or a visual representation for numeric content, and that includes size, quantity, distance, time, date, temperature, whether something's positive or negative, calculations, sequencing, or percentages. And the example I asked this audience, how warm or cold is 272 Kelvin? Would you know right off the hand what it is? You probably work in Fahrenheit or you work in Celsius, but you probably don't often work in Kelvin. And so if I was going to communicate that, moving to slide 20, I would be able to give visual representations based on the clothing you'd need to be comfortable. 272 Kelvin's pretty cold. I'd want a heavy coat, a scarf, and gloves. If I move up to 283 Kelvin, a light jacket would do. By the time I get to 294 Kelvin, I probably am going to be in a t-shirt and light pair of pants. And at 305 Kelvin, I'd prefer to have a tank top or short sleeves and shorts. So by telling people visually what that temperature is like, instead of just giving them a number, it really helps people understand, particularly when we struggle with dyscalculia or other areas that make numbers or math hard. And it also happens to help if you're trying to use a numeric system you haven't used before. Slide 21 goes with another option here, another design pattern, which is providing a login that doesn't rely on memory and other cognitive skills. Now, disclaimer, WCAG 2.2, which is the newer accessibility standard that's coming out later this year, does actually make this an accessibility requirement, but it's also just a best practice. Users need to be able to log in or register or reset their credentials without having to have a cognitive test, basically. They need to not have to memorize a string of characters or perform calculations, to copy content, to answer puzzles, to reliably reproduce gestures, or to recognize characters presented on a string and then enter them in an input field. Really, the simplest way to do this right now is with single sign-on methods, with the ability to work with a password management system, for example. And there's a lot of experimentation and new work coming out right now, QR codes or interrelationships between, again, those single sign-on systems, all of those meet this. But having a field that forces someone to type a passcode and does not support single sign-on or even copy and paste, that really provides a barrier for people using your content and your site. So avoid that. Definitely do not put those kinds of tests in. Slide 22, so we're talking a lot about kind of web pages and digital content that's more static, but break media into chunks. So when you have multiple media or a multimedia, provide some kind of organization and structure and make it easy to navigate. So if you have really long pieces of media, break it up into segments. Those segments should be logical, short, labeled, easy to identify, and easy to jump to. And slide 23 gives an example of a site that has really broken that. It is a yoga video. And if I told you that one of these videos was an AM video and one was for PM and one was around stress relief, but you had to memorize which number was which because all of these videos are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you would understand that this becomes hard. It's hard to remember it. It's relying on memory and it's not easy to find what you need. So really thinking again about how you chunk your multimedia and make it easy to navigate and get to. Slide 24 is the last of the design patterns I'm going to talk about. There are so many more in making content usable, but I wanted to just give a sample of those. It's supporting a personalized and familiar interface. And so writing and creating high quality plain language content is really critical, but it's also really great if you can find ways to make the content familiar. And that can be done by letting user preferences on presentations such as font style, font size, line heights, margins, and contrasts. So letting people adjust that, letting people go back to a previous interface version that the user is familiar with. So if you think back to that persona of someone who has trouble learning new things, that switch in software and those new designs are going to be really hard. So let them go back and use the old design. Adding semantics on controls and links and symbols. So adding some text, adding some information that helps people to really control that experience. If you think about a help icon and the fact that a question marks really clearly help, and it's often in the upper right-hand corner, letting people roll that and doing that by code so that they can put assistive technology and adjust their experience, that's really it's really a fantastic thing to do because it lets people see what's familiar and respond to that. And then making sure people know that those personalization options are there, providing clear, plain language instructions that also can help. So just thinking about that and letting people personalize that interface. Slide 25 is moving into the design guidance system. And if you are working on a team, kind of moving to slide 26, if you're working on a team with a number of people or over a long period of time, creating some kind of documentation or design guide that thinks about how you are going to handle these decisions thoughtfully and isn't just relying on a single person to make a spur of the moment decision, it's so critical and really creates a consistent familiar interface. And so they should be documentation on components, navigation approach, layouts, color scheme, fonts, icons, language. And each of these decisions can be weighed where you have new design ideas against existing conventions or expectations. This approach and documenting it saves so much time, creates a better user experience, and simplifies the testing process. So it's a great strategy. Slide is slide 27. The entire section of objective content usable has a lot of overlap with plain language guidance, and that section is to use clear and understandable content. Some of the key pieces from that document: using common words, defining uncommon words, using a simple tense and voice, avoiding double negatives, avoiding nested clauses, keeping text succinct, and using lists for list content. And that's a very small sample. We've had a deeper discussion of that, but it is included here, and plainlanguage.gov is kind of also referenced. So important things to keep in mind. And finally, slide 28, do people have questions? I think we have 5 minutes.